stage is set for the U.S. presidential elections. Kamala Harris has picked her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. The 60-year-old Democrat and military veteran is lesser known in national politics, but he has made his state, Minnesota, a bastion of liberal policy. In fact, Tim Walz has quickly gathered buzz in the recent weeks for the way he describes the Republicans, calling them weird.
You know it, you feel it. These guys are creepy, and yes, just weird as hell. That's what you see.
Now, this week, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz campaigned for the first time together in Philadelphia. In his remarks to a crowd of more than 10,000 at the Temple University, Walz talked about his upbringing in a small Nebraska town, 24 years of serving the Army National Guard, and his career as a high school teacher and football coach. He also hit out at Donald Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, saying he mocks our laws and they sow chaos and division. On the other hand, J.D. Vance has now hit where it might hurt Walz the most, his Army credentials. In the latest, the Republican compared his own tenure at the U.S. Marine Corps with that of Tim Walz's in the Army National Guard.
When the United States Marine Corps, when the United States of America asked me to go to Iraq to serve my country, I did it. I did what they asked me to do it, and I did it honorably, and I'm very proud of that service. When Tim Walz was asked by his country to go to Iraq, you know what he did? He dropped out of the Army and allowed his unit to go without him, a fact that he's been criticized for aggressively by a lot of the people that he served with. I think it's shameful.
Now, the Harris campaign has said that it has raised more than $20 million after the announcement of Walz as the vice presidential pick. How this pans out for the Democrats is going to be interesting. Let's try and understand this entire announcement of the name. On the broadcast, I'm joined by Ray Locket. He's a journalist and author. I'm also joined by Spencer Critchley, political analyst and author of Patriots of Two Nations, Why Trump Was Inevitable and What Happens Next. Good evening and welcome to both of you to Mirror Now. Ray, let me start with you first. Was this on expected lines? Was the announcement of Tim Walz's name expected from the Democrat Party, or was somebody like a Josh Shapiro expected to be named?
Weeks ago, if you were going to ask somebody, they would have said Shapiro was more likely to be the pick, or Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona. But Walz's profile has been raised considerably over the last couple of weeks based on his TV appearances, which have seemed to wear well with people. So I wasn't surprised when he was picked yesterday.
Okay. Spencer, how does Tim Walz differentiate from the other options that Kamala Harris might have had? He's got a good background, considering that he was a high school teacher. He served in the Army as well. He's been a football coach. He's now been in the politics for a few years now. Does that hold against every other option that Kamala Harris had?
Well, I think that it's true that this was not considered the most likely choice, although he did emerge towards the front of the pack just in recent weeks as he demonstrated his really formidable communication skills. And I think Kamala Harris was facing a situation where she had several very strong choices, like Josh Shapiro, like Mark Kelly, Andy Beshear of Kentucky, and some other choices who all, on paper, were very, very well qualified and had good records of achievement. But so much of being the president and the vice president is a communications role. At least as long as we remain a democracy, the president, neither the president nor the vice president can just order the government to do things in most cases, and they have to persuade. And Tim Walz, I think, matches his competitors for this position in terms of basic qualifications, matches at the least, I would say. But his communication skills were just extraordinary. And I think particularly at this time in American history, that's extremely important.
Ray, just talking about the communication skills, as Spencer said, the fact of the matter is that for VP candidates, for the running mates, American voters will obviously be looking at the presidential candidates. The VP candidates perhaps can, find and give that support to the top contender for the top post. But when you compare J.D. Vance versus Tim Walz, who do you think has better communication skills, has a better resonance with the American voter at this point?
Well, I think Walz does. I mean, he's somebody who is more reflective of his state and a big chunk of the American electorate than Vance. I mean, Vance has some skills and some things in his background that do resonate with voters. I mean, he claims his Appalachian roots, which I think are somewhat real, if not as down homey as he'd like to say. But Walz has been, he flipped a red district when he won in 2006. He represented a rural district in Minnesota for a long time. He won his 2018 and 2022 elections as governor of Minnesota fairly handily, as somebody who's not from a major metro area. So he's got talent, and he's been more tested at the ballot box than Vance, who's only won really one election. It's not a slam dunk for Walz, but I think he matches up well with Vance.
Okay. Also, just Ray, talking about the kind of policies and the kind of stance that both have taken, J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. For instance, how the Republicans call him the tampon Tim, or anything nowadays, all the conversation about the couch controversy and all of that that's been happening during these two campaigns. How do you think that is really playing out for Tim Walz?
Well, I think, Vance has come out as a relatively weak vice presidential candidate. And I think that's a reflection of the limited bench that Trump had to choose from. A lot of this is a sideshow. I mean, people are looking for some imperceptible edge against the other candidate, and they make a big deal out of something that's not a big deal. And I think that's true in the case of both guys in a lot of ways. But when you get right down to it, Vance on his record, I think, is on the wrong side of what a lot of Americans believe, particularly in terms of reproductive rights. And I think Walz is much more aligned with the majority of American voters. So that, I think, resonates. The stuff about the couch, which I don't really understand, I think that's not going to really go anywhere. I think when people get a chance to look at the two, they're going to decide they like Walz better because he seems more relatable to them. But in the end, it's really about who the presidential nominees are, and do you want to see Donald Trump, a convicted felon, back in the White House?
Okay. We'll, of course, have to see how that really moves forward, whether Donald Trump, the convicted felon, eventually wins this presidential election or not. Of course, we'll have to see. But Spencer, many also say the fact that Tim Walz was picked and not Josh Shapiro reflects the fact that they wanted somebody who has a non-threatening personality and who comes across as relatable and has more resonance with your average American voter as compared to Shapiro.
Well, at a certain point, of course, we can only speculate about what went into this choice, and only Kamala Harris ultimately is the one who knows for sure why she chose one candidate over another. Josh Shapiro has been a very successful governor in Pennsylvania, winning large majorities and maintaining his popularity, even while the state itself can be a toss-up in terms of whether it's going to go Democrat or Republican. He's also renowned for his communication skills. So I'm not sure there's a huge difference there. I would say, though, that I think that based on what I've seen from Tim Walz so far, he's not just a good communicator. He may be a brilliant communicator. He, again, based on the slim evidence I've seen so far, demonstrates a talent that you can't be taught. And ultimately, I think that talent is rooted in authenticity. Some people are brilliant at faking authenticity. I would say that's one of Donald Trump's few talents, is that he's actually very good at making people feel that he's being emotionally authentic with them, even while he's lying his head off. Tim Walz seems to have an emotional authenticity that seems to be rooted in who he actually is, and seems to be based in honesty, integrity, and as he was emphasizing in his introduction, joy. I certainly hope all that proves to be true. I think in the end, a message of hope will defeat a message of fear. Very often, campaigns, at least in the United States, but I think often around the world, end up being contests between a candidate of hope and a candidate of fear. Both of those emotions can work
Okay,
to
Spencer, then
either terrify people into voting for you or inspiring them into voting for you. Ultimately, I believe most human beings prefer hope, and in the end, it's a more powerful strategy and a more durable one.
Spencer, then let me also ask you, yes, communication is important when you're running an election, when you have to reach out to the last voter in the queue. But what perhaps is a challenge to Tim Walz? What is it that might be a problem for him in this race, that might hold him back in this race?
Well, I think that if he continues the way he's going to be in good shape. Political reporters, certainly in the United States, love to obsess over policy details and the nuances of campaign strategy, partly, I think, because they have to fill 24 hours a day of political coverage with something. And so one way to do that is to cover as if it's sports and get into all the statistics and nuances. The average voter doesn't actually care that much about ideology, usually doesn't actually know very much about ideology. And to the extent that they have an ideology, it's usually very inconsistent. And you see this on the right and the left. People respond to candidates, especially at the national level and most of all at the presidential level.
Just to be fair to the voter, to the average voter, I think you're undermining their intelligence a bit when you say that they don't have an ideology and they don't understand ideology.
No, I'm not saying they don't. I'm not saying they don't.
People have their ideology.
I think they have higher priorities, and I think very often the ideology that people believe that they have adopted actually stands for deeper emotional and spiritual and moral values that they hold, and whatever ideology they align with usually is a proxy for those deeper values. And when you press them, you find that, unsurprisingly, most people actually don't have a deep knowledge of ideology, because after all, it takes years of study to really understand these various ideologies. And so I think that ultimately, as long as Tim Walz stays focused where he is, which is connecting with regular people who are not ideologues, but who care deeply about more emotional and moral issues like the fate of their children, their own safety, the health of the environment, the health of the economy, and they care about those things in deeply emotional terms for understandable reasons. As long as he continues to communicate with them that way, as we've seen before with successful candidates bridging ideological divides, like Barack Obama, for example, or Bill Clinton, or Ronald Reagan, that is the strategy that will work with most voters.
Okay. Ray, do you resonate with that? The fact is that I understand, and even here in India, we've got a phrase in Hindi called roti kapda makan, which basically stands for, if you've got food on your plate, clothes on your body, and a roof above your head, that's all that an average voter would need. That is perhaps, can be applied to across the world, to voters across the world. But is it that simple? Is the voter not looking at your stand on several minute issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's illegal immigration, whether it's, the kind of healthcare system that you have in your country, all of that nuanced issues that affect our day-to-day lives, those are closely looked at as well.
I agree with Spencer in a lot of ways.
Spencer, I'll come to you. This was for Ray.
I do agree with Spencer's point. People vote for people they like. I mean, during the Reagan administration in the 80s, there were a lot of polls that showed that the majority of Americans didn't agree with what Ronald Reagan wanted to do on a number of things, but they liked him. He had a message of hope. He seemed like a nice guy. He made people comfortable. And when things were going relatively well, a lot of the other differences on issues didn't really mean as much. Back to your point, however, I mean, I think we've seen in the last 2 years since the Supreme Court's decision on abortion that more people have been motivated by that issue to vote. And that has really, in a lot of cases, helped Democratic candidates, certainly in the midterms in 2022 and in some of the elections we've seen since then. It's helped Democratic candidates in ways that we really hadn't seen before. So I think there are some issues that probably don't cut across wide swaths of people. People say they're concerned about immigration, but really that's a Republican thing. Republicans are motivated by that. That's going to drive them. Abortion is a different issue. I think cuts on various ways.
But you
We'll
also
see
had
how
protests, right? America also witnessed protests, Ray. Didn't America witness protests against illegal immigration?
Yes, there have been some protests, but certainly not to the extent we've seen in the UK recently. People complain about it and they talk about it, but it's not
No,
something that
certainly
gets
not.
people out on the street.
But then this is to your point, to the fact that it's not just a Republican issue. It is perhaps now spread across and citizens feel it.
They do in some ways, but not, I'd say not the way that they feel it, like the abortion issue cut, inflation cut. But really, it's
Sure.
who do you feel comfortable with? Who resonates with your values? And in a lot of cases, for a lot of voters, that's Donald Trump. And the
Okay.
challenge for Kamala Harris is to have people see that she resonates with their values.
All right. All right, we'll have to see how this really goes. But I think three of us can agree that at this point, it's going to be a mix and match of policies and personality when the American voter is looking at their candidates. I'll have to leave it there. Spencer and Ray, thank you very much to both of you gentlemen for joining us on Mirror Now and sharing your perspectives. Thank you very much.